Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to part 2 of my favourite 150 films, unranked. These are not in any order. Again, this is the fallout from doing my A to Z series, but again, it's an interactive channel, so please do leave some of your favourite films below in the comments. If you want to do 150, by all means do 150. If you want to do 3, do 3. Without further ado, let's start. Once Upon a Time in the West by Sergio Leone. That's a steelbook with a lovely little harmonica. Again, I've mentioned this film before in the channel. It's a film that I hadn't seen for years. It wasn't really readily available. It was always the Dollars trilogy that was on television pretty much all the time. So my favourite Sergio Leone was Good, Bad and Ugly. And then I finally saw Once Upon a Time in the West, and it's one of those films that literally did blow me away. Like a small Irish child on a farm. This film, in my opinion, is the greatest Western ever made. It's one of the greatest films ever made. Sergio Leone, Bertolucci, Dario Argento all sat about one summer in a villa watching American Westerns, and then Sergio Leone creates something that's better than all the American Westerns combined, with taking elements of Shane and High Noon and The Searchers and just making it better. It's about myth making, it's about the end of an era, it's about one of the greatest scores in cinema history by Ennio Morricone. More of him later. It's got an amazing performance by Henry Fonda as the villain. Charles Bronson is almost ghost-like, spirit-like, on another plane of existence in his performance. You've got a wonderful turn by Jason Robards, who's a bad guy, but we all love him. Claudia Cardinale is radiant. You know, shot composition-wise, Leone's right up there with Kurosawa and Wells and Kubrick. The fact that it's almost 3 hours long, but it feels like a much shorter film. There's lots of filmmakers that could take note on how to make a long film actually not seem long. There's not much else to say about it. I think we've probably all seen it by now. It's just a masterpiece in every meaning of the word. Again, when I first got a projector, Once Upon a Time in the West was the first film I watched. Seeing Henry Fonda's whole face take up a wall is quite impressive. It's just a stunning film, and it is one of the films that is in the conversation for my favourite film of all time. Again, these 150 list is not ranked, but I did say I would mention ones that are in the conversation for my favourite film of all time, and Once Upon a Time in the West is one of those films. Next is another one of those films that might be in the conversation for my favourite film of all time. Michael Powell's Peeping Tom. That's the Blu-ray, and that's the Criterion DVD. It's by number 58. This is a film that famously pretty much ended Michael Powell's career. It was not understood at the time of its release in 1960. Everybody loved Psycho instead, but for some reason hated Peeping Tom, which is far superior on every level. Apart from, the dialogue, which has aged a little bit, prostitutes selling themselves for £2. It's one of the first films, along with Psycho, that the protagonist, which is also the antagonist, is still sympathetic, and we feel empathy for them rather than just being a mad, crazy killer. It's a great performance by Carol Burnham. It's just an exquisite film about a sociopath, but it's also about cinema itself and how we like to watch. It's about voyeurism and scoptophilia. It's just an amazing film. It still stands up today. It's still effective. Michael Powell playing the overbearing psychologist father is a nice turn. It's a nice twist. The final seconds kind of stay with you. The final reveal of why his victims have a terrified look in their face is just sublime. It's a truly great film, and it's one of my favourites. Next on the list, there's probably going to be a few of these. It's John Sayles' Men with Guns. Sadly, only on DVD. It's another one of just about every John Sayles films that deserves a Blu-ray. This was made after Lone Star, when he got an Oscar nomination for his script. He then went and made a film that's completely, well, not completely, about 95% in Spanish with subtitles, about a doctor played by the luminous Federico Lupi, who've been Kronos and The Devil's Backbone with Del Toro and lots of other films. He plays a doctor who's kind of serves the rich and the powerful. I mean, we literally we're introduced to him when he's got his finger up the bottom of a military leader. Very subtle, Mr. Sayles. It's the story of this doctor who thinks he knows everything, who has trained these trainee doctors and sent them out to the countryside to help people. He finds out one of them's been killed. This kind of shakes his belief. He wants to find out what happened, and then as he crosses the country, because it is a classic road movie, he encounters different people on the journey, and he finds out what happened to his students. It's just such a beautiful film. He meets a deserter from the army, he meets a little boy, he meets a rape victim, he meets a fallen priest, and as he finds out more about their journey, he finds out more about his journey. Again, with Sayles, it's just beautifully written. Doesn't matter who he's writing for. The script is wonderful. It's a brutal film, but it's also beautiful. And it's a film that really deserves more exposure, like all of John Sayles' films. It's just stunning, and it's one of his masterworks. And I urge you to see it if you haven't seen it before. Next is a Giuseppe Tornatore film that's not Cinema Paradiso. It's The Legend of 1900, which I think is his masterpiece. I mean, Cinema Paradiso is a very good film. For me, The Legend of 1900 is a masterpiece. And I know masterpiece is one of the most abused words in cinema and culture in general, along with genius. But this is just absolutely stunning. Again, it has another amazing Ennio Morricone score. I mean, the title track will bring tears to a glass eye. It stars Tim Roth as a boy, then a man, who pretty much spends his life on an ocean liner that goes from London to New York, and he plays the piano. He's a savant at playing the piano, which sounds really fascinating, doesn't it? But it's absolutely gorgeous. It's moving, it's funny, it's just wonderful. If you can find the director's cut, which is 169 minutes, again, it's another long film that doesn't feel long. Made in 1998. And again, Cinema Paradiso Arrow have announced they're releasing a 4K of it. So that's like the second or third time Arrow's released that on Blu-ray or 4K. And as you'll have noticed, this is an Italian Blu-ray of Legend 1900, because it's just not, as far as I know, it doesn't have a UK or a US Blu-ray release, and that needs to be rectified, because it's just a stunning film. It's one of the best films of the 90s. Yeah, and for me it's Tornatore's best film. I would actually rank The Best Offer and Unknown Woman higher than Cinema Paradiso for me, but that's just me. Next is Bergman's Wild Strawberries. Myself and Nazarene Prod's other channel, Ronan Nazarene Talks, we're doing a Bergman deep dive through his work, so we've done a video on Wild Strawberries. You can check that out if you're interested. This is a film, for me, as I get older, becomes more and more resonant, and the last few times I've watched it, I've found the ending more and more powerful and more moving. Again, it's another road movie, and this just follows a professor as he's going for an award, and it's kind of time for him to reassess his life, which again has been done countless times since, and perhaps a few times before. But Victor Sonnström's performance, who was a big influence on Bergman, and one of his films might very well be on this list somewhere too, gives a great performance. Max von Sydow turns up briefly. Ingrid Thulin, who's my favourite Bergman actress, is stunning in it. Gunnar Bjornstad, who's a regular to Bergman, is fantastic in it as well. It's just a beautiful film with dream sequences, flashbacks. It's probably one of Bergman's more accessible films, but that shouldn't really be held against it, because it's just a stunning piece of work. Next, Alexander McKendrick's Sweet Smell of Success. Again, that's the Arrow Academy Blu-ray, and that's the colourful Criterion DVD, which is spine number 555. Never before has a black and white film been made. Just a stunningly beautiful film. The cinematography by James Wong Howe is fantastic. The script is just peppered with quotable lines. Burt Lancaster, even though he kind of doesn't appear until a little way in the film, we hear about him and know what he's like before we actually see him on screen. Tony Curtis's best performance, one of Burt Lancaster's best performances. It's just jet black. It's a perfect example of how great American cinema in the 50s was. Not a feel-good film, but you'll feel good from a cinematic perspective, from a script perspective, from a performance perspective. It's just an amazing film that just never gets old. Next is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, the only film playwright Tom Stoppard ever directed, based on his own play. It's about the two minor characters in Hamlet, but Stoppard focuses on them and gives them fun stuff to do, and occasionally the real Hamlet play crosses into the film. Again, it's not for everybody, but it's just got an amazing script. Tim Roth and Gary Oldman are just wonderful. There's chemistry. Gary Oldman's he's a bit of a doofus, but he invents, or potentially invents, these strange things that Tim Roth just stands on. Tim Roth is more pragmatic. The pair of them turn up without a clue what's going on, just like the audience. Richard Dreyfuss is in it. Originally there was plans for Sean Connery. Dreyfuss plays the leader of the players that comes to Hamlet's court. Ian Glen plays a really good Hamlet, and again, he's not in it all the time, they just kind of crisscross, but he's excellent in it. Again, I remember, I must have seen this in video, made 1990s, so I probably saw it in the early 90s, and have loved it ever since. Again, it's not for everybody, but if you love wordplay and just the joy of wordplay and the joy of words, it's just an amazing little film that's well worth your time. Next, again, is probably one of those films that's in the conversation for my favourite film of all time. It's the Coen Brothers' Miller's Crossing. For me, it's their best film, and it's one of those films that you could easily, well, I could easily argue that it's perfect. The Coen Brothers, whether you like them or not, they are very good at building a world for their characters. And this world that they create for Miller's Crossing is just wonderful. The production design, the look of 20s gangsterdom is just wonderful. The greens, the browns, the cast is just top notch. Gabriel Byrne, John Turturro, Marcia Gay Harden, who plays the gangster's Moll, but she's tough as well. She's not just a screaming girlfriend. And Albert Finney is just fantastic as one of Albert Finney's best performances. It's got one of the best sex scenes in cinema history because you don't actually see anything. It just pans to a window with open curtains, and then there's a quick dissolve back into open curtains, and that leads to an action scene with Albert Finney. Again, it's one of the most quotable films of all time. The Coen Brothers not only create a world, they also create a language. They create a slang that people use. So it's a film that's an 18 certificate. Well, it used to be an 18 certificate. I've just noticed it's only a 15 now. It used to be an 18, but there's no swearing, there's no sex, there is some strong violence. Personally, I would still have it an 18, but it seems to be a 15 on Blu-ray now. But they create a slang, so even though we don't know specifically what they're saying, we know what they're saying. Steve Buscemi turns up in a small role. It's just perfect. The plot is twisty-turny, as Gabriel Byrne's Albert Finney's right-hand man, and then he swaps sides with John Polito, who wants to take over, and his sidekick's J.E. Freeman, who's just magnificent as the heavy. Again, we don't know ahead of the audience what's happening, why Gabriel Byrne's doing this, or what's actually happening. We learn as the characters learn, which is the best way. It's just a beautiful film, perfectly paced, perfectly shot, perfectly written. It's got a great score. It's just an amazing film, and when you consider this was only their third film, and it's the film after Raising Arizona, which is like a live action cartoon, that's what they were going for. And then 3 years later they do Miller's Crossing. It's I think it is the most, or one of the most underrated Coen Brothers films, because it doesn't have that kind of quirky, slightly off kilter humour or whatever. It's actually their most straight film. There's not as much humour in it. It's fairly dark, but it's just so I know like people who are fans of the Coen Brothers films who don't actually like Miller's Crossing that much, because it is more straight and it's dark and there's not as much kind of weirdness about it. I mean, there's a couple of Coen Brother kinks in it, but it's not as strange or weird as some other films. It's just a stunning film. Again, I saw this in video when it came out, so it's 30 years pretty much. Yeah, fantastic. Next for me might be the greatest film of the 21st century. It's The Act of Killing, which again I've talked about. I've done at least one video on it. A documentary by Joshua Oppenheimer. I would recommend watching the director's cut, which is on this, which is 159 minutes rather than the theatrical cut, which is 115. Yeah, this is about the killing of quote-unquote communists in Indonesia in the mid-60s, which was pretty much supported by the West. I mean, America had headlines celebrating, you know, a million people killed, but it's okay because they're communists. This is a film very much like The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On. It's a documentary, but you're watching it and you kind of question, why am I watching this? This is dubious, as Oppenheimer spent a couple of years with these people who are quite open, admitting that they killed people during this time. They were rewarded, they were treated as, you know, celebrities, they were gangsters essentially. And he gets them to recreate their crimes, but in the style of 50s and 60s Hollywood films, so musicals and gangster films, because that's what they watched in the cinema at the time and then went round the corner and killed some people. So you do kind of find yourself going, why am I watching this? This is a little bit morally dubious. But then as the film progresses and we kind of focus on one of the three guys more, there's a moment that can only really happen in cinema that is one of those jaw-dropping moments, which I won't spoil for people who haven't seen it. I mean, you can get The Act of Killing and the follow-up, which was actually filmed before, called The Look of Silence, where one of the victims, whose father was killed, pretty much interviews some of the military leaders that were responsible for it under the guise of being an optician, which they could only release once The Act of Killing was released. I mean, in most of the credits, all the technical roles are filled by Anonymous, because they pretty much feared reprisals, because it's the same, not the same people, but it's pretty much the same government that's in charge. It's an astounding film. You'll never hear Born Free in the same way. It's challenging, it's difficult. I mean, Werner Herzog and Errol Morris were blown away by it when they first saw it, and they kind of helped get it distributed and a bit more exposure. Again, it's difficult, it's challenging, but it's profound, and for me it's one of the greatest films of all time and of the 21st century. It's not a film that you would watch every weekend, but now here's a film that you might watch every weekend. This is Spinal Tap, which is arguably the greatest comedy ever made. And there's the Steelbook, which is, as I say in the back, it's how much more black could it be? None more black. That's because remember, there's a thin line between being sexy and, well, yeah, thin line between being stupid and clever. It's a mockumentary, more a rockumentary, as Rob Reiner captures the sights and sounds and smells of a hard-working rock band on tour. There's lots of incidents of, you know, that are referred, that happened to Black Sabbath and Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin. There's like an extra about 45 minutes, 50 minutes of outtakes that are just as good as what's in the film. The one flaw of the film, it's only like 82 minutes or something. It could have easily been 2 hours. It might, if it was 2 hours, it might be the greatest film ever made. Again, if you're into rock or metal like myself, there's even more enjoyment to be had. But even if you're not, I think there's still a lot of pleasure to be had. You kind of have to watch it 2 or 3 times to get every single joke and every single reference. Again, like the best comedy, it's mostly the character stuff. It's not the big things like, granted, the Stonehenge faux pas is really funny. I think you're making too much of a big thing about this. Making a big thing of it would have been a good idea. It's just so good. But again, it's the little one-liners, it's the little character bits that give the most pleasure. The songs, no matter how ridiculous they are pretty close to the truth, and they're not ridiculous. It's just, they obviously did their research really well, and it's just fantastic. If you don't laugh at this as Spinal Tap, there's something wrong. Next is My American Uncle, or Mon Oncle Amérique, by Alain Resnais, from 1980. 121 minutes long. This is the Arrow DVD. Again, this is one of those films that is in criminal need of a Blu-ray. When I saw this film, it was on BBC Two. Strangely enough, people who watch my videos will know quite a lot of the films I love I originally saw on BBC Two in late night. And I remember Mike Hodges introduced it, and when I watched it, literally, it's one of those films that will change your life, which might be a bit of an overstatement. It won't change your life, but it will make you seriously consider your life, seriously consider the choices you make, seriously consider why you do the things you do, why we stick to the same routine. It also kind of shows you that you're not unique, because it makes you identify with the characters. It's universal because we've all been through the things that the characters go through to some extent. It's an interesting setup. You have 3 characters, including Gerard Depardieu, and we follow events in their lives from a kind of third person perspective. And then there's a 4th character who's a biologist who tells us about their behaviours. And then about 2/3 into the film, there's just something that happens from a kind of aesthetic standpoint that you will either love or you will hate and think it's a gimmick. But it absolutely blew me away the first time I saw it. The first 10 minutes is kind of tough because it's just the biologist talking, and there's still images, and there's lots of big words, and but once you get into the actual character stuff, it's just amazing. I'm being a little bit sarcastic because the first 10 minutes is fabulous. But it is one of those films that will make you take stock of your life. And I know that's perhaps sometimes not what people want to see. But it's just a stunning film. Resnais made some stunning films in his time, but My American Uncle is just amazing. Next is a film that I've only seen recently. I did a random review of it because I had to, because again it just blew me away. It's The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez. This is a Criterion Region A Blu-ray, spine number 940. Edward James Olmos stars. Again, it just blew me away. It's based on a real story which happened in Texas about this guy who was kind of wrongly identified for stealing a horse, and due to translation problems, people die. He goes on the run and he's chased by, it was the biggest manhunt in American history at that point, or Texas history at that point, and And the court case led to, it was the first American court case to actually have a translator in the court. I mean, it was a low budget film. It's just full of character actors, like James Gammon, but it's amongst his best work. Directed by Robert M. Young. It's just a stunning film. It looks amazing. What it's about is obviously sadly still relevant. Yeah, if you haven't watched it, please check it out because it is amazing. I know I'm saying amazing a lot, but it's a beautiful film. And again, it's one of those films I've only seen relatively recently, but it's a straight up 5-star film and it's just stunning. Next, it's Manhunter. You probably knew it was coming. One of Michael Mann's masterpieces. This is the Scream Factory, which has the theatrical version, which I wouldn't bother with. The director's cut, which is better, but if you can get your hands on the European video cut, that's probably the best cut. It doesn't have the 2 scenes that were added to the director's cut that, to be honest, don't really add much, and it has added lines from the Atlanta PD visit, which features Bennings from The Thing. Yes, again, this came out, saw it in video, blown away by it in the late 80s. Way better than Silence of the Lambs, but I won't get into that because it's not even worth talking about. Talking about Manhunter. Production design, Michael Mann's use of architecture, the architecture of the shot, putting objects in the foreground, background. Brian Cox is amazing. Hannibal Lecter, even though he's in it for like 2 scenes. It's a tour de force. It's ominous. It's threatening. It's just stunning. Yes, you could say, well, the score has aged a little bit, but I think that's being a little bit nitpicky. It's a straight up masterwork, and one of the best American films of the 80s, if not the best American film of the 80s. Next is Seven Samurai. That's a Steelbook, and that's the Criterion DVD with book, and it's by number 2 on Criterion. Yeah, what do you need to say? I don't think we really need to say anything about Seven Samurai apart from another long film that doesn't feel long. Another film that, yes, you can say it's influenced by the West. Obviously the West then has remade it 72 times, I think. Toshiro Mifune, Takashi Shimura. Stunning battle sequences. It's one of those films that when people die, when characters die in it, you're genuinely upset. And that doesn't happen in action cinema a lot, if at all. But when the professional dies, the master dies, who's trained all these years on swordcraft, and then he dies by some drunken one-eyed bandit firing a pistol or a rifle from like halfway across the battlefield, you're upset. Every time I watch it, I'm like the rookie in the rain, crying his little eyes out. Yeah, it's one of the few action films and few films in general that when people die, you genuinely miss them, which is hard to do. Yeah, I mean, it's a masterpiece. It should be in everybody's top 150 list. Yeah. I've even got the soundtrack. And finally, for this episode, Glengarry, Glen Ross, based on the David Mamet play, directed by James Foley, written by Mamet, and he added the wonderful Alec Baldwin introduction scene, the motivation for the estate agents. It's Alec Baldwin's finest performance of his entire career, and he's only on the screen for 8 minutes. It's just an amazing film. It's all talking. If you don't like films with just all talking, then you're probably not going to like it. But it's about working for a living. Jack Lemmon, who was nominated for the supporting actor but didn't get it probably because he swears a lot. I mean, he should have got that performance. The more you see the performance, it's just one of his best. It might be his best performance of his entire career, and that's saying something. The cast is redonkulous. Kevin Spacey before he was famous, and then before he was a Predator. Al Pacino. Joe Mantegna actually played Ricky Roma on the stage and thought he was going to play Ricky Roma in the film, but Al Pacino ended up playing it. Ed Harris is wonderful. Alan Arkin is gold as always. Jonathan Pryce turns up as the poor victim of Al Pacino's character. I mean, I'm so sad that I actually had it recorded on a audio tape for the kids out there, and I had it in a personal stereo, and I used to just listen to it. When I was travelling, I would listen to Glengarry Glen Ross on my headphones. That's how sad I was. I remember renting it out when I was at my uncle and aunt's house and forcing my cousins and uncle and aunt to watch it, and of course they were just like, what is this? Nothing's happening, people are just sitting about talking, and they all just left because it just did their head in. It was a film where people just talk for an hour and a half. Where's the car chases and explosions? I don't. There is a robbery in it, which obviously we don't see. It's just a stunning film. Jack Lemmon's performance is heartbreaking, even though he's not playing a particularly nice character. And Mamet's dialogue is just like sweary poetry. I remember there was a review book that had rated R for relentless profanity, which I've never seen since. No sex, no violence, just relentless profanity. But to be honest, it comes in chunks. It's not continuous sweariness. It does come in chunks, but oh, what sweary chunks. Yeah, it's a truly fantastic film, but again, not to everybody's taste. So thanks very much for watching part 2 of my favourite 150 films of this kind of moment. Who knows what 2021 or 2022's list will look like. Again, these films are not ranked. My 150 isn't ranked. That would just be crazy. But that's another 15 on my list. And the next video will have another 15 on the list, strangely enough. So thanks very much for watching. Again, leave your comments below of 15 of your favourite films, or what you think of the 15 films that I've talked about in this video. And hopefully we'll see you again for more 150 film videos. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.